Hey folks, welcome back to the shop. Got the shop coffee going. We are going to start on a knife as promised. So let me show you what we got going on. My buddy Doug's been waiting for one of these videos. So let me give you a brief history. Fast forward if you don't want the brief history. I started making knives a few years back. My dad collected pocket knives and all kinds of knives. I have a knife collection now. He's passed away. But my buddy Arnold, let me show you who he is. If you look at this picture, let me find him. He's right there with the hat on. Pretty talented dude. He's been making knives for quite a while. And if you think I'm talented, he's got more talent in his little finger than I do in my whole existence. So my dad wanted one of his knives once he saw he was making knives. And Arnold's pretty busy. He works full time. He's paramedic supervisor, I believe. But I didn't want to ask him to make one because he's way too busy and everybody's asking him to make one, and he's always making them for fundraisers and raffles and stuff like that for good causes. So I thought, why don't I just start making them? I know my way around the shop a little bit. I'll make Dad a knife. So I made Dad a knife. It turned out pretty good. I made him a couple more after that. I made a duplicate one out of the last deer that he shot, some of the antler portions of it. And I made a matching pair for him and I. I still got mine, but his got given to my cousin Jeff because they got the same initials, and the initials were in the handle. But anyway, I started making knives, and that's why I did. So I've made probably 30 knives at this point. I give most of them away. I think I only have one. The other one, the pair to the one I made for Pop. But I end up giving them all away. The last one I made, I swore I was going to keep, but my brother really liked it, and I gave it to him. So I'm going to make another one. Hopefully I can keep this one. But again, I'll probably end up giving it away. So here's what we're doing. I don't have my forge anymore because I sold it before I moved. I have yet to build my new forge. So I need to start with some steel that's already hard. So I just went down to the hardware store and got one of these heavy duty lawn edger blades. It was only $10. It's what I actually made my last knives out of, and I'll show you a picture of those. So here's what the blade looks like. You can get two knives out of one of these blades. They kind of back to back there. But what we're going to make this time is something similar to this. It's going to be a finger hole knife, combination cutter skinner. It's not quite long enough to make this type of knife, so when I cut this piece off here, I'm going to weld it down here. And it's going to be a good through weld all the way through, good penetration. It's not going to hurt anything. I'm going to keep this in cool when I weld this little seam here, so it's not going to mess with the temper of this blade here. So we're going to get this thing cut out and weld that piece on, and I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. All right, we're getting ready to weld up. We got this little piece cut off the end down here, and we're going to put it on the end down there. I raised it up a little bit so we had the right profile. I could come down where I needed to. The jaw face on my vise wasn't perfectly parallel, so I cut these two pieces of angle iron to sandwich it in there real nice. So you see we left a gap in it, so we're going to get full penetration in that weld. And we're going to keep this end down here cool as we do it. Put a wet rag on it every now and then and cool it, make sure it stays cool. So we're going to get this done and we'll be back. All right, we got both corners tacked. We got it sand it down flush, and we're going to weld this flat so it gets a nice good bead in it, full penetration. We'll let it cool. We'll keep the outer edge cool, and we'll sand this flat, get a flat profile, turn it over, clamp it back down again, and weld the other side, and we'll sand that flat. All right, we got that welded. When you're welding something thin like this, start from one side, weld to about the middle, and then stop. You need to stay cool anyway, so stop and cool everything off. And then start from this side and weld to the middle. Reason being, if you weld all the way across that, by the time you get to the other side, it's going to be too hot and it's going to drop out this corner. But if you start cold on this corner, it's going to leave enough weld there that when you sand it down, you're not going to have a divot. So half to the middle, half to the middle. Okay, this is the back side. As you can see, we pretty much got full penetration all the way across. But we're going to take this side down, make it flat. All right, we got the profile done. After we got the welding, we finished drawing the profile. And then we started out with the 4.5-inch cutting wheel, and we started cutting the rest of the profile around. Anytime you got an indentation like here, you'll just make some cuts into almost to your line, and then come in back this way and just start cutting those little notches out. Same way here, you cut in as far as you can without hitting your line, cut in as far as you can here without hitting your line, and then come in this way and cut to where you ended there, and then cut to where you ended there, and then just start nibbling away at this stuff, and then just keep cutting in, cutting in, cutting in, cutting in, and it'll go. And then you'll have kind of a rough kind of layout. Make sure you don't get too close to your line, because then you'll start getting divots in it. And then come in with your grinder wheel, turned up on edge like that, and then you can clean that up. And then come in with your flapper wheel, and then you can just kind of go around the edges and clean it up a little bit. You want to take it down to where you don't see any more of those notches anymore. That's pretty clean right there, but we're going to put it on the bands, not the bandsaw, the belt sander, and clean it up a little bit more. If this is too tight of a radius for the belt sander, we'll get in there with the Dremel, or we'll put the drum sander on the drill press, put a little block of wood there or something, and come around there with that. But remember, the hole in the middle was already there, so it's got a real good feel to it. My thumb's right in the right hand spot. The handle is the right thickness. It's going to feel pretty good. I thought about following this contour down around and then doing a clip point on the end, but I can always do that later. I kind of want to see what it's going to look like without that. I think if I do that, this point's going to be so sharp, it's going to be hard to keep that hard as we're sanding. So I probably want to keep this a blunt point like it is. But now we're going to face grind this. I do that with my belt sander. If you don't have a belt sander, let me show you. Get a magnet. And I bought one of these magnets on Amazon. It's a super strong magnet like this. It's got plastic covers on it right now so it doesn't get nasty stuff stuck to it. But I'll take this magnet. You can put it in your vise, and your knife will stick to it flat. And if you got a hand belt sander, like the kind with the little belt that you hold with your hand and not a stationary belt sander, just stick that knife to that and hit the top of that with that sander, and you keep changing your grits. You don't necessarily need a sander that's on a stand. I've done that for a lot of years too. But let me get that face ground, and we'll clean up the edges a little bit, and then we'll be ready to start doing the bevel. Well, for old time's sake, and just to show you that you don't need a bunch of fancy tools, I'm going to do this the old-fashioned way. So I put the magnet in the vise, got my little belt sander out, just one of those handheld ones that people use for woodworking. I probably picked that up for $15 or $20 at a flea market. And you can get all different grits for it. And you're just going to come over the top of that thing and just sand it flat. And make sure you keep the sander flat when you're doing it. You don't even really need power tools when you do this. A lot of people did this with files and hacksaws and stuff back in the day. If you got access to a torch, you could normalize this steel, heat it up red hot all the way through, and then let it sit and cool on its own slowly. Don't quench it with any kind of water or anything like that. Let it cool down on its own. And that'll make that a lot softer, where you could use hacksaws and files and all that stuff. You don't have to have power tools. People do the whole bevel with files. It works, and then they just reharden it. If you got a torch, you're going to heat it back up to where it's no longer magnetic, and then you're going to quench it in some oil. Don't do it in water. Make it too brittle. But it can be done. It's not hard. You don't need a fancy shop or a bunch of fancy tools to do this. Okay, we've only sanded on this thing for about 30 seconds. As you can see, it's already taken the powder coating off. Touch this thing every now and then. Make sure it's not too hot to the touch where you can't hold your hand on it for a little bit, because you don't want to lose the temper on this if you're not going to be hardening it. We're almost there. As it warms up, you can get a damp rag. Just kind of hit it real quick. Help cool it down so you don't have to wait so long. You're not really quenching it or anything like that. So, and it's not red hot, so it's not going to hurt it. But just keep touching it. That's fine. It's cooled down again, and we'll hit it some more. Alright, that's as far as we're going to take that side. It's probably about a 220 grit on the sander. You can see we got a little low spot right here. That's not going to hurt anything because we're flat all the way around that. That's going to be under the scale, so it won't hurt anything. And if you look real close, that is not a crack. That is actually the shoulder of the weld where it's slightly undercut. That's not going to hurt anything either, because remember, we got full penetration. And when we grind the edges, these little divots here will disappear. It'll be all nice and smooth all the way around once we get that over on the belt sander and clean all the edges up. So we're going to flip it over and we're going to do the other side. Alright, there's the other side. You can see right here when they stamp these blades out, it kind of rolled that edge over a little bit. So when you sand it, it doesn't quite get it. But this is where our bevel's going to go for the blade. So that'll come off. So I'm not too worried about that. We had one little spot here where I got a little too aggressive with the flapper wheel when I was grinding that weld off. But if you look at the side profile of it, you're not going to see that. And you can't even feel it when you run your hand across it. You can't feel any of this stuff. So once the scales are on there, you'll never see that. When polish those edges up, you won't even know that's under there. But that's what she looks like. And I think we're going to call it a night. You can see the brand names are still in there, and everybody's going to be like, you didn't make that knife? That's a steel knife. Like, nope, I made it out of a steel lawn edger blade. Look up the part number. You'll see it's not a knife. Next process, we're going to drill some holes in this, but I think that's going to wait until tomorrow. It's getting pretty late. So this is raw carbon steel, and it's had some water on it. So this will rust overnight if it's not dried out real well. I have dried it, but what we're going to do is we're going to hit it with some WD-40 and wipe it off, and that'll make sure that this thing's not going to rust overnight. And we'll get back out here again tomorrow and kick it off again. So I lied, it didn't go in. You get going on stuff like this, you want to just keep going. It's fun stuff, I really enjoy it. So what I did is I went over to the belt sander, set the table at 90 degrees to the sander. I took all the edges down to where it lost all those little divots. Made it nice and straight and flat all along the edges. All these edges are going to be sanded a this direction once I start hand sanding, so those little cross marks are going to go away. But you can see just sliding around on the table, you get these little scratches. So we're going to have to hand sand all that out, which we were going to do anyway. And I don't go down to a mirror finish. I kind of like the brushed finish look. So we'll go down to maybe 400 or 600, but we're not going to go to like 1,000 grit or anything like that or polish it, because I think if you polish them up, people think they can't use them. But it'll look better than it does right now. You can see all the little surface scratches. But we'll get everything going in the right direction, because that's just from sliding around on the sanding table. So what I'll probably do, instead of drilling the holes, I'm going to take this in the house overnight, and I'm going to heat treat it in the oven. So we're going to go 400 degrees in the oven for 3 hours. And then we're going to shut the oven down, and we're going to let the oven cool off on its own, leaving the door shut. And I'll pull this out in the morning. It'll be kind of a gold color. And it doesn't really soften the metal. I guess it does sort of. But what it does, it takes the brittleness out of it. Because this metal's so hard right now, if I were to drop it, say on a rock or something like that, it could snap and break. So by heat treating it is going to make it a little bit less brittle, to where you can drop it and you don't have to worry so much. So we'll do that overnight, and we'll see you tomorrow. So this is what she looks like after being tempered. And I think I used the wrong terminology last night. I told you I was going to heat treat it, but it's actually called tempering. And if you look at the Rockwell hardness scale, it looks like we're about 230 or 240. And that may not mean a lot to a lot of you, but I really don't know what it means either. But I just know that's what we're looking for, that kind of that deep straw color. So now we're going to drill some holes. And I think I'm going to put 2 pins in it and probably a lanyard hole. So we'll get ready to do that. Okay, you can kind of see I got them marked out. I drew kind of where the end of the scale is going to end up. And I try to keep it symmetrical, keep the same width here as I got here. Makes it look a little better. This is going to be our lanyard hole, which we're going to do with this stuff. And then I located this spot here, and then I just kind of split the difference with that one there. Alright, we got all 3 of those holes drilled. When you're drilling, it's going to leave a little burr on the back side, so make sure you sand that off a little bit. If not, it'll come off when you start hand sanding. If the material is really hard and you're having trouble drilling a hole, I found these bits years ago. These things will drill through anything. You can drill through a file, a brake drum, any kind of hard stuff. This stuff goes right through it. Look up Rodman tool. I found them at the Ag Expo show one year at a booth and bought me a small set. They got a full set of these things. It's very expensive, but I've got the small set. I think cost about 80 bucks for the small set. But if you don't want to buy those fancy bits, if you got some good cobalt drill bits or something like that, they'll do it. The key is lots of lubrication. Make sure to keep the bit cool, the material cool, and lots of lubrication. Use a cutting, like a cutting oil. WD-40 sometimes just doesn't cut it, but use like a cutting oil that you'd use for like tapping or something like that. Go to the hardware store. They'll know what you're talking about. But you should be able to drill through that stuff. Well, I had that larger bit in the drill press. I came through and drilled some divots into the side of the tang. That's going to give it a little bit better adhesion for the epoxy when we put the scales on. It gives it a little more to grab too. And I did it on both sides. Okay, I started with 400 grit sandpaper to see if I could get the lines out with that. Try to concentrate, keep your strokes as straight as possible. Squirt a little WD-40 on the blade as you're sanding. It's kind of a wet sand. Don't spend too much time on the tang because you're not going to see that. As long as it's flat enough for the scales to glue down, you're fine. Just start working on the blade. So that's about 10 minutes worth of sanding. Obviously you could spend a lot of time on this, a lot or as little. It's up to you how fine you want to get that, but to me that's pretty good. I may go to a 600, but I'm not sure. The finer you go, the finer you gotta go, because you'll start seeing little mistakes that you made, little cross grain scratches that take a lot to get out. You almost got to back up some grit, start with a heavier grit again, and work your way back down again. So we'll see how far we're going to go. All right, we've hit it with 600 grain, and I think that's as far as I'm going to take it. Just like sanding wood, you want to do long strokes. You don't want a short stroke and then go over here short strokes, because you're going to get weird change of direction stuff right going on in the middle. So do full strokes, real careful all the way across. When I start getting into the finer grain, I got this little piece of wood that I use. It's kind of egg-shaped. So if I need to get into a sharper area, I can turn and use that side of it. But I'll put the sandpaper on it and I'll do real long strokes. And once your grit, when you feel your grit's worn off, you just turn it, sandpaper around it a little bit, then you got new grit, and just keep going. So I'm going to flip it over and go 400 and 600 on the other side. A good rule of thumb while doing this hand sanding is I use these quarter sheets of sandpaper. You can buy the whole sheets, just cut them into 4 pieces. But I fold them twice. Fold them in half and then fold them in half again. So once you wear all the grit off of one side, turn it over and then use those 2 sides. And once you've worn the grit off of those 2 sides, you're probably as far as you need to go with that grit. All right, that's as fine as I'm going to take it. And there's always going to be touch up later. But we're ready to start grinding a bevel on that edge. I'll show you how we do that. So I did end up making it a clip point because it was looking a little too boxy for me. So I put a little dip in that. I'm just going to have to be careful when I do the bevel that I don't overheat that tip. I'm going to have to cool it off quite often. But we can do it. So we're going to start grinding the bevel. I don't know if you can see it or not. I took a black marker and I marked the whole edge on that. And then you take an item that's the same thickness as your blank and grind it to a point. Some people use a drill bit, but drill bits are a little tough because they're not a real fine point on the end. But take that, put it on a flat surface and scribe it, and then flip it over and then scribe it again. And I kind of got 2 lines, so what I'm shooting for is right in between those lines when I do my grind. But that'll help keep your grind in the middle. You can see the 2 lines there. I'm going for that dark line right in the middle. So I didn't do it today, but a while back I created a fixture that bolts to the table on my little 1-inch belt sander. And what it does, it allows me to get right up on that corner of the belt. It kind of gives me a little concave grind, like a hollow grind almost when I grind it. And what I do is I put a piece of painter's tape on here, and that allows me to keep the knife flat, and then I just run it along that that wheel, that belt right there. And I'll show you what it does. Make sure you got your cooling water handy, because you want to keep that tip nice and cool. So there's the first pass. You can see it's pretty even all the way across, and that's what you're looking for. If I was doing a full bevel, a lot of people do it by hand with no fixture. Those are the guys that are going to a full-on shiny blade, and they're going to use progressively finer sandpaper and make the whole thing shiny. But since I'm not doing that, I use a fixture so I can keep everything nice and straight, and I don't have to come back and do a bunch of finished sanding. But I'll run a pass, and then I cool it, run it past, cool it. Okay, I've about reached that center line, so we're going to flip over and do the other side. And as we get the other side real close, we'll have to be switching back and forth, and we'll be looking at the edge of it, making sure we're staying in the center. But that's what she looks like. I'm going to switch out that painter's tape because it's getting dirty. You can see we're getting really superficial scratches, but we'll have to polish those out. And when you're sanding this blade, keep the blade to where it's going straight on with the sanding wheel. So as you're sanding, you're rotating the blade around. You don't want to be in here like this. Make sure your blade is straight on with the wheel so you're rotating as you come around. And there's a reason I do this without gloves on, because when you got your fingers on this thing, you can feel it, and you can feel when it's getting too warm, and you can cool it off. So if you're wearing gloves, you're not going to be able to feel that heat in time, and your tip of your blade's going to turn blue on you, and that's not good. Okay, we got both edges on. We're going to call it a day today. This is what we got after 2 days. We did a little hand sanding, but you can see there's still a couple little fine lines we need to get out of from sharpening the blade. But other than that, it's looking pretty good. It's very sharp. But end of day 2, that's what we got. And we'll start up again tomorrow. All right, day 3. We got the fire going. We got the shop coffee getting ready. So we got the knife all polished out pretty much last night. Of course, there's going to be some touch up on it. We need to start thinking about a handle, so I'm going to check out what we got. So we started thinking about scales. I have some manzanita here I've been wanting to use. I'm going to take this over to the table saw and slab a little bit out of this and see what I can get. See if I can get some without a crack in it. There's a few natural cracks in here, but like this is wide enough, I think, for my scales. And when you do your scales, you want the grain to be long grain going this way. You don't want end grain, because end grain tends to snap. So the grain is going to run this way when we cut it. So our scales are going to be this way and not this way, of course. All right, I got that manzanita all cut up. Bunch of different scales. That's going to last a long time. I got 2 good stacks of them. I got some interesting grain structure in this one that I'm really liking. So I'm going to use this. You can see that crack in it. The crack goes up, across. So as long as I stay below that crack, I should be good. And I should be able to get both sides out of this one piece. So we got the scales for this knife roughed out, and we cut them a little bit big because we're going to start drilling the holes in it, and then we want to actually, when we start profiling the handles, we're going to sand them down to meet the edge of the blade. So we want it to be just a little bit wider when we start. However, once we get the holes in, we're going to get these lined up and put together with the pins temporarily, and then we're going to finish this front face as it would when the knife is going to be done. Because once we get the handles put on the knife, it's going to be very hard to sand and everything, that front face of that. So we want to get that pretty much 100% done before we move on. That way, once we get it glued together, we're not going to be scratching up the blade up in here by trying to sand the fronts of these. But for right now, we're going to get the holes drilled in these. So we got the first hole drilled in. You can see the scale is wide all the way around. So we put the first pin in, and that's going to keep everything aligned while we drill this next hole here. And we'll make sure that we stay in the middle as we're drilling that hole. Then we'll put that pin in, which will keep everything aligned when we drill this hole. And then once this is all done, we'll take the knife out of here and we'll put the two pieces together and we'll drill through the other matching piece. Alright, we got the lanyard hole drilled, and then we stacked the other piece on the bottom. We drilled the lanyard hole all the way through, put the lanyard pin hole or the tube all the way through. Now we're going to pull probably this pin, drill that one all the way through, put that pin back in, remove this pin, drill that hole all the way through, and then we'll be all lined up. We'll put that pin, and all three holes will be perfectly in alignment. We drilled it with a drill press, so they're perfectly 90 degrees, so we won't have any problems during glue up. Always put a board underneath, and that'll keep your scale from tearing out on the back side once the drill bit goes through the scale. This wood here will support it. I just move it around a little bit so we're not drilling in the same hole. We always got a fresh surface when that drill bit breaks through. So we'll get the rest of those glued through, and then we'll start cleaning this up, and I'll come back when we have the front of those cleaned up. Okay, we got the scale temporarily pinned back on the knife blade so it's not going to move around. We drew our what we want to be our final line on the front. Remember, we want to keep kind of the same width here as we do here and here. Try to kind of keep it a little symmetrical. So we're going to pin both of these blanks back together without the knife in it. We'll take it to the belt sander and we'll sand right down to that line. Alright, we got the finish sanding done on the end, tapered at a 45. We got the same amount of material on either side of the center. A little blurry, there you go. So we're going to do some hand sanding on that to dress it up a little bit and give it a more of a refined polish. A little rough right now. And then we're going to take these scales, bust them apart, remembering which is left, which is right. We'll mark the center, and we need to sand the inside of here on both of these so they're perfectly flat. So when we glue them up, there's not any gaps or anything around it. So we'll be back. All right, we got that sanded down with some 400 grit. Beautiful looking wood. You can see how the grain kind of both goes upward and inward. Like Bob Ross used to say, that's a happy little accident. It wasn't planned that way, it just came together. But if you want it to do that way, you need to pay attention and put your scales together in the right direction and cut them in the right direction, the orientation. So now what we're going to do, like I said, we're going to sand the insides of these so they're perfectly flat. And then we're going to glue this thing up. Coffee's ready. Time for a break. Here's to you, folks. Find something you like doing, get out and do it. All right, here's the best way I've found to flatten those out. I'm starting with, I think it's 180 grit paper. No, this is 80 grit. And tape it down to a nice flat surface, and then just work it flat, back and forth. And keep looking at it. You'll know when it's flat, because you'll see little areas on it that aren't quite sanded. But once the whole side looks sanded, you are flat. And I like to keep it a rough grain like this, so when you epoxy it, it's got a rougher surface and it tends to hold a little bit better. All right, we got those scales flat on the bottom, perfectly sanded, both sides. We did a final polish on the blade, and then I covered it in painter's tape. Then I applied each scale to each side, and I ran a razor blade right along the front of that scale. So what that's going to do is going to keep the epoxy from getting any that squeezes out onto that knife blade. And I did that on both sides. So when we glue that up, anything that squeezes out is no longer going to be a problem up there. I've wiped down the inside of the scales and the knife with some denatured alcohol to get off anything greasy or oily. And we're going to go glue this. All right, we got this epoxy in this thing. You see I use Q-tips to clean stuff up. There's my stick. I use painter's tape to mix the epoxy on. That way I don't absolutely ruin this board. I just peel it right off. On the front here where we had the painter's tape, I use the denatured alcohol and a Q-tip to clean out any squeeze out that I get around that front area. It not only makes a mess, it will keep your wood from absorbing any kind of preservative that you put on the wood. It'll kind of give it an off color. And inside these grooves, I use a Q-tip to get most of the epoxy just scraped out of that groove. That'll save you a little work later. If this thing was full of epoxy, it's kind of a mess. And I use those pliers to grab the pins and turn them and work them through, so I'm not pounding anything with a hammer and breaking the wood or anything like that. But this thing's going to sit for a while now. Yeah, it'll be hard enough later where you could probably pull the clamps off and do a little work on it, but most of the epoxies say, even though they're 5-minute epoxy, it's not fully cured for like 24 hours. So we're going to have some patience and just let this thing sit and harden up. I brought it into the house because our fire that we built outside is eventually going to go out, and it's going to get cold out there again. But it's going to stay nice and climate controlled in here in the house. And we're going to let her sit. All right, day number 4. The epoxy is cured. We had it inside the house last night. I came out last night to close the shop up. I cut those pins off with a bandsaw. And then we're going to start doing some sanding to profile that handle. First thing I'm going to do is narrow up these scales a little bit. They're just a hair too wide, maybe take 1/8 of an inch off either side. And then we'll turn it this way and we'll grind down to the edge of the blade all the way around. And then once we get a good edge there, we'll start profiling the corners all the way around and getting the final profile done. And then it's down to just hand sanding after that. We'll be back. All right, we got the scales down to the width that we would prefer. We've also got the edges sanded all the way around down to the tang. So now we're going to start working on the corners because we still got square corners. And then once we take care of the corners, it's just a whole lot of hand sanding. We'll make sure we got the same width all the way around. Looks like we maybe just a hair thicker on this side, but we will check. It's hard to tell. I'll measure it. Looking good. As we start rounding the corners, we're going to be using this part of the belt up here that's unsupported because it'll rotate a little bit and it's more forgiving than this down here that is supported. You might get kind of little sharp corners or indentations if you're standing on this area here that's back. So we're going to use this area right here. Well, here she is after a crap load of hand sanding. Got 400 grit on the handle. Took the tape off. You see we changed the direction on the grind marks. They're now going the other way. Get up in here, we got the Dremel tool out with the little sanding wheel on it. Change the direction on those lines up in there because it was too tight to get the belt sander up in there. With lots of hand sanding. We're going to rub a little bit of boiled linseed oil into this scales here. And we're going to make the leather for it next, but I'm going to do that on a different video because this video is getting way too long. But that's how she come out. I hope you can see that it doesn't take a lot of crazy shop equipment to get something like this done. Don't be afraid to do it. What's it going to hurt? You know, your first knife may not be perfect, but at least it's something that you made. Anybody would enjoy having it. Nobody's ever going to turn down a handmade knife. And what people don't realize, the thing about custom knives is there's no other like this knife in the world. This was handmade by one person, and you're not going to find a duplicate of this anywhere because it's not made from a pattern, just hand drawn out and a little bit of craftsmanship. You got a custom knife. So you figure we've got 3.5 days into this. Some people wonder what to sell these knives for. What's your time worth? Most places charge $100 an hour for shop time. So you figure $100 an hour into this knife, 3.5 days, you're looking at 28 to 30 hours, probably a little over 30 hours once you do the leather, times 100. So people want to buy these knives. Oh, I'll give you $45 for it. No, I don't think so. But I'll give it away to people that'll really enjoy it and treasure it a lot more because it's made by somebody they know. It becomes a family heirloom. So we'll catch you on the next video. Like I said, we're going to make the leather for this knife. There you go, Doug. There's your video. Jason, I hope you're not afraid to make something like this, and now you saw the steps. See you later. There's Brandy the Wonder Dog. Stay safe and stay healthy.